poverty that's pushing a lot of these people to do some of the things they do. Have you found that to be true?
Well, I don't think poverty necessarily means people become criminals, but I do think that if you're in a situation in which you have always fished your waters, you've always been able to make a profit from your fish, the fishing industry sustains the livelihoods of your local area, and suddenly, because of overfishing, often by industrial trawlers, you're not able to do that anymore. People have to live, and so people sometimes look for other alternative livelihoods in relation to in order to sustain themselves, and that might be illegal fishing themselves, or it might be engaging in other forms of illicit activities which are very profitable, but that actually contribute to maritime insecurities.
Now, you know, the Horn of Africa used to have a challenge, but now it seems like the Gulf of Guinea is almost overtaking that. Can we marry the kind of economic situations of the countries in that region with what is happening?
I think there are some key differences. So if we take the issue of piracy and sea robbery.
What is the difference?
So piracy takes place on the high seas between two ships. Sea robbery takes place in the territorial waters of states. So essentially there are important, it's a geographical distinction. The same action can be sea robbery if it happens in one place or piracy if it happens in another, but it has legal implications. So if something happens in the territorial waters of a state, then it is in that state's own sovereign jurisdiction, and it is up to them to prosecute. If it happens on the high seas, it's more complicated. So that's one of the differences. Now, that's important because off the coast of Somalia, most of the piracy activities that went on did take place on the high seas. So they challenged international trade routes, and they took place a long way from land often. Here in the Gulf of Guinea, a lot of the attacks take place much, much closer to shore, so they take place in regional waters. That's one important distinction. The other important distinction is the model, the business model that the pirates use. In the Western Indian Ocean, it was focused almost wholly on kidnap and ransom. Here, it's much more complicated. There's kidnap and ransom, but there's also the theft of cargoes, including oil, bunkering, siphoning oil off ships, robbery of crews, and from the ships themselves. Now that's important because it requires a different kind of supporting infrastructure. In Somalia, it was very localized. You required somewhere to keep your ship and your captives, and that required very localized accommodations with local political authorities. Here, it's much more sophisticated. It needs to be for piracy to work, it needs to be integrated into local markets. You need somewhere to sell your materials. You need port facilities and infrastructure to process things. You need mechanisms for laundering your profits and so on. So it's a much more sophisticated, much more organized business model than perhaps was the case in Somalia. I would like to see attention given to not just on what happens at sea, which is important. Enforcement at sea is important. But I think if we're looking to the longer term, it involves how we think about tackling some of these issues on land. And my key takeaway would be to think about piracy not primarily as or just as a security threat at sea,